From the Missouri School of Journalism, welcome to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. We're talking about the South American country of Ecuador today. Many people know Ecuador as the home of calm and picturesque natural sights, from the Galapagos Islands and the soaring Andean peaks to the lush Amazonian rainforests. But the media environment in Ecuador is not so serene. President Rafael Correa, now in his third term of office, regularly files lawsuits against journalists and even cartoonists who mock his government. First elected in 2006, Correa has used his weekly television addresses to tear up copies of newspapers he doesn't like and singled out his Twitter critics by name. His government even hired a Spanish firm to use copyright law and complain to Facebook and Twitter about social media posts insulting the government. Last year, Ecuador tried unsuccessfully to weaken the ability of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, a watchdog group, to interfere in cases of systemic or grave press freedom abuses. With all this, the Committee to Protect Journalists made Ecuador the only Latin American country on its annual risk list of countries where freedom of expression was most under threat. And now Ecuador's new communications law is being used as a tool to stifle criticism of Correa's administration and make the media a public service and thus subject to government regulation like a water utility or electric utility. This week on Global Journalist, we're discussing Correa's efforts to silence his critics and the resulting decline in press freedom. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Alexander Brockwehl, a Freedom House researcher specializing in Latin American countries. From Ecuador's capital of Quito is Mauricio Alarcón-Salvador, a lawyer and project director at Fundamedios, an Ecuadorian press freedom group. And also from Quito is Carlos Andres Vera, a filmmaker and journalist whose own work has been censored. Welcome to all of you. Alexander Brockwehl, I was wondering if you could just give us an overview of what the media environment has been like and how it's changed over the last 7 years under President Correa.
Absolutely. First, thank you very much for having me on the program. Freedom House evaluates press freedom on an annual basis in our Freedom of the Press study. From the period of 2008 to 2013, Correa took power in 2007. Ecuador experienced the second most significant decline of any country in the world during that 5-year period. So there was another decline this past year. In 2013, Ecuador became a not free country, one of only 5 in the Americas region. I think kind of a few unique things about Ecuador. One is just how rapid that decline was, and two, the diversity of tactics that we see. Freedom House looks at the political environment, the legal environment, and the economic environment. In the case of Ecuador, you don't have a situation like you have in some other countries in the region where there's a lot of violence against journalists. You have a situation where almost all of this is coming from the government, directed at the media community, whether it's through judicial tactics of bringing lawsuits or legislative, creating new legislation to restrict the practice of journalism. Or actually going after individual users, as I'm sure we'll get into more, Twitter users, hiring private firms to take down content. So it's a real diverse range of tactics they've used to restrict.
So it's not an issue of drug cartels as it is in Mexico and some other Central American countries where journalists can just be shot, threatened, in that same sense.
Absolutely. Whereas in other countries like Mexico, you have kind of a confluence of factors, including non-state actors, making it a very restrictive and challenging environment for journalism. Here, it's almost exclusively the government. I mean, there were definitely concerns about the media environment in Ecuador before Correa came to power. Then those were in some cases legitimate. But in terms of restrictions on media and the practice of journalism, it's coming almost exclusively from the government itself.
Mauricio Alarcón of Fundamedios, I want to ask you, you're in Quito. If you are a person on the street there reading a newspaper, watching television, what would you notice that has changed? Like, how do you see and feel the difference in what the newspaper, what you see on television is telling you?
Well, there have been a lot of changes related to media and journalism in the country since 2007 when Rafael Correa assumed power. For example, now you are not able to read any corruption investigation in a newspaper, or you are not able to see something related to corruption in a TV show or in a news program. Now, for example, this interview spaces like The ones that we used to watch on TV have disappeared. We just have a couple of spaces, like a half an hour spaces for interviews related to what's going on in the country, but that's it. From our point of view, Fundamedios, an organization that works on freedom of expression and freedom of the press issues, we have seen that aggressions, threats, attacks against journalists and media have changed a lot in the country, because the first year we made our annual report, that was 2008, there were just 22 attacks against journalists. But now, last year, 2014, we have reported more than 250. And also the types of attacks and aggressions have also changed, because right now the main aggressions come from public officers, especially the president of our country. And you now also have cases of journalists that have been murdered in very strange circumstances, with no investigation process related to the public attorney here in the country. So it's a very hard situation right now. As Alex said before, we have journalists sued because of their opinion, not for their information. We have also cartoonists being prosecuted by attorneys and by this superintendent of communications created in the communications law, with fines related to the media of a lot of thousands of dollars. For example, Diario El Universo, for publishing a cartoon from Bonil, was fined with $90,000 last time. So
right, I understand that was one of the most high-profile cases. It was sort of a landmark for a lot of journalists. Carlos Andres Vera, I was wondering, you just heard Mauricio Alarcón saying that the number of attacks on journalists, press freedom violations, had grown from 22 in 2008 to 250 in 2014. To you, what were some of the most significant incidents or examples? Mauricio had just mentioned the example of a cartoonist being fined. Are there others that really have stood out?
Well, the president sued an opinion journalist for $80 million, and he had a favorable sentence for $40 million. I mean,
what was his opinion? What was the view that he was expressing that was so dangerous?
The journalist was saying that in the future the president may get sued or may get in trial because of what happened on the 30th of September of 2010. He was suggesting that the president may be in trial for violating human rights in the future.
Okay, and this was related to an incident involving the police in 2010.
Right. But I mean, how common is it that for giving that opinion, you get sued for $80 million, and the justice gives you.
Alexander Brockwehl, I wanted to ask you. I understand there was also an incident where a number of newspapers were fined because they did not provide sufficient coverage of one of President Correa's trips overseas. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the one specifically you're talking about was his trip to Chile. A number of newspapers were punished, as you'd said. This is something that was also enshrined in this communications law, where essentially news outlets have to publish information that's deemed to be in the public interest. And if they fail to do so, that is also considered a punishable offense. So this is what you see in that law. There's a number of very vague stipulations. One relates to kind of one of the sort of defamation or this concern that the president had of being overly criticized. Another relates to this obligation to publish information of a certain type. Correa considered this to be in the public interest, and so he punished the outlets who failed to cover it.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's program, we're talking about Ecuador's efforts to stifle criticism of President Rafael Correa's government in news media and online social media. We're joined from Washington, D.C. by Alexander Brockwehl, a Latin American researcher at Freedom House, from Ecuador's capital, Quito, by Mauricio Alarcón-Salvador, a lawyer and project director at Fundamedios, an Ecuadorian press freedom group, and also from Quito by Carlos Andres Vera, a filmmaker and journalist. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Global Journ. Mauricio Alarcón, I was hoping that you could talk to us just a little bit about this communications law that was passed in Ecuador in 2013. Now, we tried unsuccessfully to get an interview with the Ecuador's superintendent of information and communication, who is sort of the overseer of Ecuadorian media now, as I understand it. But unfortunately, we weren't able to have him on the program. But I did read an interview that was published on a Canadian website with him, and one thing that he highlights is that Ecuador's media in the past has really been controlled just by a small group of people. The statistic he used was that something like 8 families controlled more than half of the radio and television spectrum there, and that media houses, television stations, radio stations, newspapers were really used as a weapon against politicians by the business interests that controlled them. So in his view, basically, what organizations like yours and others define as free expression is really just free expression for large corporations. What do you make of that argument?
Well, that's not true. According to a national study done by this government in 2009, more than 90% of media belongs to small owners and even single citizens. So less than 10% of the media in the country, newspapers, radio stations, TV stations, are related to a small group of people. So what he was saying is definitely not true. For example, they call this a media corporation. They call El Comercio a media corporation because Grupo El Comercio has 2 newspapers and 2 radio stations. Is that a media corporation? That's not true.
So you don't, I mean, you would challenge that assumption then that too much media is controlled by too few people in Ecuador then?
Of course, and you have to check this government's study related to the media. It was done in 2009, and the government is responsible of the information in that study, and the study says this, and that's it. So there's no reason why this superintendent says this lie, because it's not true that we were, before Rafael Correa's government, ruled by a powerful media corporation in the country. That's definitely not true. And now this communications law that has passed through a very, very hard debate since 2009, and it was approved, as you said, in 2013, now is the weapon he uses for punishing media and punishing journalists. One of the best examples of this communications law and its effect is that superintendent has said, for example, that the massacre of Charlie Hebdo in Paris could be never happened in Paris if they had a communications law. So that's definitely stupid. I'm very sorry.
They're making the argument that this
word.
communications law would prevent something happening like the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris.
Yeah, that's what they say, because of course the communications law regulates even the opinion expressed through a cartoon. So now that's the situation in the country. Media is punished for not publishing how many newspapers they have produced. Media is punished for publishing an opinion. Media is punished for publishing a cartoon without making censorship first. So it's definitely stupid, the effects of this media communications law in the country.
Carlos Andres Vera, I understand that you yourself...
I'm sorry to interrupt. I would like just to add one more thing about what Mauricio was saying. I mean, before 2 or 3 bankers used to own lots of media, and that changed because the government changed the laws. And now the media that was owned by the biggest banker, the Isaias family, that are corrupt bankers basically, is now owned or controlled by the government. So, I mean, the biggest media corporation right now is the government media corporation. They own like 3 TV stations. They own like 4 diaries, newspapers. They own many radios. So nobody has more media right now than the government. So when the government talks about, people owning media, it's kind of an irony, because the government right now controls most of the media, and if you see how they proceed, how they treat the news, it's not public media, it's government media. So they are basically the guys who own most of the media right now in Ecuador.
Well, Carlos, let me ask you about one area of media that they don't control, which is social media, Twitter, Facebook. Tell me about your experiences on social media. I understand that you have had posts removed, that you've run into some difficulties.
Well, yeah, and the thing is that I am not the only one, and you mentioned something about it in your introduction. What the government has been doing is hiring a Spanish pirate company named Ares Rights that basically uses DMCA copyright law.
Sorry,
to censor.
that's a U.S. digital copyright law.
Yeah.
And they're using this law how?
But because Twitter is based in the U.S. and Facebook is based in the U.S. and WordPress is based in the U.S. and we all use these platforms, what Ares is doing is that they are basically using that law to censor all the contents that they don't like on the web. So documentaries have been, banned out of YouTube. Posts have been banned out of WordPress.
So in
Twitter
other words, then,
accounts.
if you put a post on YouTube or on Twitter that is critical of the government, makes use of an image that may have come from somewhere else, Ares will complain to YouTube or to Twitter saying this is a violation of U.S. copyright law. This post needs to be removed on that basis. Is that correct?
Yes, but they have mastered their techniques as well, because Twitter and Facebook and YouTube and all these platforms have lots of weaknesses. When an international company makes a complaint, what Twitter does is they first suspend your account and then they investigate the case. So it doesn't matter if you actually published something that is under copyright law or not. You get suspended, and after many suspensions, you get a definitive suspension.
So in other words, then you can go back to Facebook or Twitter or say, actually, this post is within the bounds of fair use under copyright law. This should not have been suspended. Eventually, they may restore that post, but by that time, it's too late. Is that correct? Or the news is old, the moment is past.
But you have to understand that you, as a normal citizen, don't have the power or the arguments or the knowledge to defend yourself against an international company that specializes in this. So when it comes to if you see it from the point of view of Twitter or YouTube or any of these platforms, they won't take many risks. I mean, they, in one hand, have a citizen that is, complaining, and in the other hand, they have an international studio that specializes in this, talking, in legal terms. So it's not like you have an equal force. You don't have equal forces, facing each other. You have to really work in order for you to, get your account unsuspended or get your post published again.
You're listening to Global Journalist. I'm Jason McClure. On this week's program, we're talking about Ecuador's efforts to stifle criticism of President Rafael Correa's government in the media and in social media. We're joined from Washington, D.C. by Alexander Brockwehl, a Latin America researcher at Freedom House, from Ecuador's capital, Quito, by Mauricio Alarcón-Salvador, a lawyer and project director at Fundamedios, an Ecuadorian press freedom group, and also from Quito by Carlos Andres Vera, a filmmaker and journalist. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter @GlobalJourn. Alexander Brockwehl of Freedom House. President Correa was reelected in 2013 by a large margin. Now, before this election, there were changes made to the election law specifying how the media would cover that election. Can you tell us about these and sort of what the result of those changes to the laws were?
Yeah, that stipulation essentially greatly limited the amount of coverage that was possible of the election. It really deprived, especially opposition candidates, of public appearances, of being shown on TV. It made it very, very difficult for anyone to mount a significant challenge against the president. That definitely contributed largely to that landslide election. He did also go in with high levels of popularity, and there weren't strong opposition candidates. However, basically, it made it extremely restrictive on the extent to which journalists could cover the election itself.
And Mauricio Alarcón, I was hoping you could tell us just a bit about President Correa's weekly television addresses, because I understand that he devotes a lot of time to criticizing his critics in the press and his critics online.
Well, this weekly show that we called Sabatina was established in 2007 when President Correa assumed power, and it was supposed to be a public space for talking about what was the government doing and the activities during that week for the president and his ministers. But just a few weeks later, this program was established. He started attacking journalists, especially journalists. But after that, citizens and critics with very, very bad words and with big pictures, and part of the scenery of the Sabatina was even pictures of journalists. For example, one of the best examples of what happened with this Sabatina is one a few years ago done in Guayaquil, when President Correa said, we are more than the ones that are out there yelling against my government, so go out and do what you must do for me.
So he was essentially starting a Twitter war with his critics.
Well, it started not with a Twitter war. It started with physical war. A lot of journalists whose pictures were published in this Sabatina have been attacked in a supermarket and while walking on the street. Now the Twitter war has started a few weeks ago. So we can't say that this is just the beginning after more than 400 broadcasts of this weekly program. Attacks have been permanently going on in this weekly show against journalists, against media, against citizens who criticize the government. So this is not a public space for telling what the government is doing. This is a public space for attacking people who think different and who express their opinion in a different way than the government says.
And Carlos Andres Vera, I want to ask you about this weekly show as well, because it is such a spectacle in some ways that John Oliver, the host of Last Week Tonight, an HBO comedy show, actually singled President Correa out and highlighted some of the unusual things he does during this broadcast, like picking on 18-year-old people on Twitter who criticize the government. Could you tell us just a little bit more about that? Are people in Ecuador, are they familiar with all of this?
Yeah, of course. I mean, he is basically the guy who gives all the material for the media for all the week through this, Saturday show. I was telling you about this before starting the program, that if anybody does what John Oliver did on a media station or on TV or in radio, he would basically go to jail or have to face, of course, facing a trial first, a sue maybe, and then going to jail, because nobody dares to, make fun of the president like John Oliver did in Ecuador anymore. Nobody even thinks about that. And nobody's joking about the president. Nobody's mocking about his, on how ridiculous it is for a president to pick up on an 18-year-old guy who is insulting him or menacing him on Twitter, because these things happen. These things are normal, and a president shouldn't be doing things like that. So if you mock him like John Oliver did, you basically are in very big trouble if you do that on the media. And that's why the John Oliver thing was big here in Ecuador. All the media was commenting that in the social media, everyone was sharing the video. Nobody before knew who John Oliver was, and now he's like a celebrity in the country, but not because he's a brilliant comedian like he is, but because things like that don't happen anymore in the country. You just don't see them. They are very unusual.
Alexander Brockwehl, we mentioned earlier that President Correa won by quite a large margin in 2013 in his re-election campaign. Where do you see the future of press freedom going 5 years from now, 6 years from now? Are we going to be talking about the same issues, or do you foresee that there will be some changes?
Unfortunately, the future looks very bleak at the moment. You have a president who's considering pursuing essentially unlimited re-election. That's probably going to be something that will happen in the coming year in a process that is not following the constitutional process that it should. It's not going to referendum. You have a very, kind of beleaguered press, journalists who've just been attacked, very much kind of under threat for publishing their opinions, a civil society that's also been under attack. Unfortunately, organizations like that of Mauricio and others, they're also the subject of President Correa's cadenas and his pretty brutal and often personal critiques and attacks. As a result of this media environment, in part, it's very difficult for any opposition candidates or opposition parties to get the proper kind of exposure to really mount a meaningful campaign. It's a climate in which it's extremely difficult to voice any kind of dissenting opinion. And as a result, I think it's especially if he does manage to successfully put through this unlimited re-election reform, it's going to be very, very hard to imagine improvements in the situation. I think it's very concerning. We're very worried, and unfortunately, our kind of sort of prediction is not a good one.
That's all for this edition of Global Journalist, a production of the Reynolds Journalism Institute and the Missouri School of Journalism. If you're interested in more Global Journalist content, visit us online at globaljournalist.org. There you can read in-depth articles on international affairs and free press issues and download past episodes from our archive. We're also on social media. You can like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at GlobalJourn. Many thanks to Alexander Brockwehl of Freedom House, Mauricio Alarcón-Salvador of Fundamedios, and filmmaker Carlos Andres Vera. This week's producer is Nassim Benchabane, with assistance from Jinghong Chen, Eva Kautz, and Phoebe Seston. Our technical director is Travis McMillan from RJI, and our audio engineer is Pat Akers of KBIA. For all of us at Global Journalist, I'm Jason McClure. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.